He had driven 4 hours without music, which was how Quinn Larimer knew he was in trouble. Not the corporate kind. Not the quarterly shortfalls or the acquisition that was stalling, or the board meeting he'd canceled twice in the last 10 days. The other kind. The kind that settled somewhere behind his sternum and had no deliverable, no resolution, no clear path to closing. His father had been dead for 12 days. Quinn had told his assistant he needed time to manage estate matters, which was true the way most things Quinn said were true. Accurately incomplete. What he had actually done was drive alone from Calgary to his father's old cabin in the Kananaskis country, sleep 2 nights in a dead man's bed without changing the sheets, walk the property in the rain without knowing what he was looking for, and then turn the car around and point himself back toward the Trans-Canada, feeling no different than when he'd left. He had gone hoping to find something, some residue of the man, some closing note, and had found only the smell of pine smoke and a coffee mug still sitting on the counter, rinsed and dried, the way his father always left things, ready for next time. He pulled into Canmore just after 6 in the evening. The October light was already failing, the flat gray Alberta dusk that didn't so much fade as give up. He needed gas. He realized with the particular clarity that exhaustion brings, a bathroom and something to eat and probably 8 hours of sleep that he wouldn't actually get. He was reaching into the back seat for his bag when the edge of his jacket caught on a bent piece of metal housing at the corner of the pump. He heard the tear before he felt it, long and deliberate, from the left cuff nearly to the elbow seam. Quinn stood there and looked at it for a long moment. He had a breakfast with the Halpern Investment Group in Calgary tomorrow morning. This jacket was the best one he'd brought, the only good one, in fact, because he'd packed in 15 minutes and hadn't been thinking clearly about anything. The reaction that moved through him was disproportionate, and he knew it was disproportionate, which did nothing to stop it. It was a jacket. It was wool and thread. He went inside, paid for the gas, and asked the woman at the counter if there was a tailor nearby. She pointed him 2 blocks up Main Street, Kershaw Alterations. Don't know if Josephine's still open, but her light was on when I drove past at 5. The sign above the door read, Kershaw Alterations, family-owned since 1976. The paintwork had faded at the edges. The shop window was warm with yellow light, and through the glass Quinn could see spools of thread arranged on a shelf in descending order by color, amber to crimson to deep plum, like a small, orderly sunset. He tried the door. It opened. A woman looked up from behind the counter, somewhere in her mid-30s, hair pulled back, gray work apron over a flannel shirt. She held a seam ripper in one hand with the easy familiarity of someone who had been holding one since childhood. "We're technically closed," she said. Then she looked at his sleeve. "Bring it over." Her name, as he learned from the nameplate on the counter and confirmed by a framed photograph on the back wall. A woman who shared her cheekbones standing in front of this same shop, squinting in the summer light, was Josephine Kershaw. She examined the tear without touching it, first, the way Quinn had seen surgeons look at imaging results. Then she took the jacket, spread it carefully on the cutting table, and reached for a needle without asking him a single additional question. He stood on the customer side of the counter. There were chairs along the wall, but he didn't sit. He had not been able to sit still in 12 days. The shop was quiet in a way he was not accustomed to, not the tight silence of a boardroom before a difficult conversation. Something older and less conditional, a mechanical clock on the wall, the occasional snip of scissors, the sound of her breath, even and unhurried. On the wall beside her workstation hung a small wooden board covered in pinned notes and cards, handwritten, most of them short. "Thanks for the anniversary dress. You saved my graduation. The buttons are perfect, exactly like she described." Below the board, a glass jar held safety pins of different sizes. Taped to the front was a slip of paper in careful handwriting. "Some things just need a little holding together." 40 years, Quinn asked, nodding at the sign in the window. 48, Josephine said without looking up. "My mother opened it in 76. I took over when she passed." He didn't ask when. He'd learned, in recent weeks, that people didn't usually want the timeline question asked. She worked for another 20-odd minutes. When she held the jacket up to the light, the repair was nearly invisible. A slightly tighter weave along the seam, barely detectable unless you knew exactly where to look. "That's exceptional," Quinn said. "It's a nice jacket." She laid it on the counter and wrote up the receipt, $65. Fair by any measure and possibly underpriced. Quinn reached into his trouser pocket. Then the other one. He had left his card holder in the car, not his wallet exactly, but the slim case he'd been using since his wallet was stolen at YVR 3 weeks before. He had been running on Apple Pay since then, and his phone had died somewhere around Dead Man's Flats, with no charging cable in the car. I don't have cash, I can tap. She nodded toward the card reader which sat on the counter with a small handwritten sign. Out of service. Back Monday. He looked at it. Then at her. There's an ATM. Down the hill. Been out since Thursday. She said it without frustration, as though it were simply weather. No hurry. He stood there. Quinn Larimer, who had authorized a $47 million construction contract by phone from a chairlift, could not pay a $65 tailoring bill in a mountain town on a Tuesday evening. Josephine looked at him for a moment. Not the way people usually looked at him, calculating his usefulness, measuring his authority. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the jacket, calmly, trying to understand what she was actually dealing with. Then she picked up her pen, crossed out the dollar amount on the receipt, and wrote something in the space below. She slid the paper across the counter. Quinn looked down at it. Balance owing. One thing you're not ready to say out loud yet. He read it twice, then he looked up. I'm sorry? You can settle it whenever you're ready. She folded the jacket carefully and set it in his hands. There's no late fee. He opened his mouth. He had run a company of 230 people for 6 years. He negotiated. He managed. He had never once been handed a receipt that asked for the contents of his chest. This isn't a standard payment arrangement, he said. No, she agreed pleasantly. She turned back to her work table. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he folded the receipt, put it in his breast pocket, picked up the jacket, and left. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes without starting the car. He told himself he was going back in the morning to pay in cash. That was all. He was at Kershaw Alterations by 9:15 with 4 $20 bills. Josephine was threading a sewing machine needle. She looked up, saw the cash in his hand, and shook her head. We're even. We're not, Quinn said. $65. Here's 80. I don't want it. You repaired my jacket. I know. She went back to threading. You still owe me. He stood in the doorway of the shop with $80 in his hand and felt for the second time in 15 hours at a genuine loss. He had a flight to Calgary in 2 hours. He put the cash back in his pocket and sat down in one of the customer chairs without quite deciding to. Josephine worked without filling the silence. He found after a while that he didn't mind it. An older man came in at 9:45. Late 70s, deliberate in his movements, wearing a plaid shirt so pressed it might have been ironed that morning. He carried a garment bag and set it carefully on the counter. Morning, Josephine. The buttons held up, just like you said. Morning, Mr. Hartfield. She unzipped the bag and ran her hand along the lapel of the dark suit inside. How was the wedding? Beautiful. My grandson looked just like his grandfather used to. The old man was quiet for a moment, his hand on the lapel. I thought I'd bring it back in before winter storage, in case it needed anything. She checked the seams, the cuffs, the button thread. It's perfect, all set. He reached into his shirt pocket. She shook her head gently. You already paid, Mr. Hartfield. I know. This is for being careful with it. Spend it on yourself, warmly, without apology. He smiled, folded the suit back into the bag with the hands of someone accustomed to handling things worth keeping, and left. Quinn watched the door settle closed. You do that a lot, he said. Do what? Turn down extra money. She considered this, sometimes. He looked around the shop more carefully than he had the previous evening. Something he'd missed before. Near the back wall, half obscured by a bolt of winter fabric, a large corkboard was mounted at eye height. Pinned across it were what appeared to be old receipts, dozens of them, different sizes, different vintages, yellowing at the margins. Each one had a red stamp pressed across the bottom. Paid in full. He got up and walked to it. The receipts were dated across several decades. Some were so old the handwriting had retreated to a ghost of itself. Others were recent enough to still be crisp at the edges. Each one was different: a winter coat lining, a bridesmaid's dress, a boy's first communion suit, a jacket hem taken in for someone who'd lost weight they hadn't expected to lose. And on every single one, in the same careful hand he had seen on his own receipt the night before, was the same crossed-out balance and the same replacement. Balance owing. One thing you're not ready to say out loud yet. He turned around. Josephine was watching him. "How many of those are yours?" he asked. "About half." She paused. "The rest are my mother's." He came back to the counter, and this time he did sit down. "Why do they all say the same thing?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went to the back room and returned with 2 mugs of coffee, one black, one with a splash of oat milk. She set them on the counter and leaned against the edge of it. "My mother grew up in a small town in New Brunswick," she said. "Her family didn't have much. When she was 16, she ruined her only good winter coat, caught it on a fence." A brief glance at Quinn's sleeve. She took it to the seamstress in town, an old woman who didn't ask how she'd pay. Just fixed it, handed it back, and said, "Come back and tell me how things turn out." Quinn wrapped both hands around his mug. "That's it?" "That's it." Josephine smiled slightly. "My mother went back 6 months later because she had nothing else to offer and felt she owed the woman something. They had tea, talked for 2 hours. She looked at the corkboard. She said it was the first time in her life an adult had listened to her like her words were worth something." He was quiet. "When she opened this shop, she kept that. She noticed people coming in on hard days, not always hard money days, hard everything days, funerals, divorces, first days of things they were terrified of. She noticed that the coat was rarely the whole problem." Josephine looked into her coffee. "So she started writing that line. Not for everyone. Only when she sensed someone needed it more than they needed a transaction. She called it a standing invitation. You didn't have to accept it right away. You didn't have to accept it at all. But if you came back and you were ready to put something down, she'd be here to listen. And you kept the tradition." "I kept it." A pause. Outside on the street a truck went past. The clock on the wall kept its small, even time. "Did they?" Quinn asked. "Come back?" "Most of them. Eventually." "And when they did?" She looked at the board with its dozens of red stamps. She listened. She didn't try to fix anything. She just listened. A pause. That was apparently enough. Quinn missed his flight to Calgary. He told himself it was because he'd lost track of time, which was partially true. He rescheduled the investor breakfast for the following morning and booked a room at a small hotel at the edge of town. He ate dinner at a restaurant where the server knew everyone else's name but not his, which he found, unexpectedly, restful. He was back at Kershaw Alterations the following afternoon. There was no convincing reason for it. He had cash in his pocket. She refused it, pleasantly and without discussion, for the 3rd time. He accepted this with considerably less argument than before. He came back the day after, and the day after that. He told himself each time it was for minor practical purposes, to ask about winter storage for wool, to return a measuring tape he'd pocketed accidentally, to see whether she knew a good dinner spot. None of these explanations survived even his own limited scrutiny. What he noticed, over the course of those afternoons, was that the shop had something he had not encountered in a long while. Not a product or a service or a structural advantage. Stillness, the unforced, stubborn stillness of a place where people were attended to, and time was not considered wasted on them. He watched Josephine work. She moved through the shop the way people move in spaces they have always known. Without hesitation, without surplus motion. She knew where every spool was without looking. She could identify a fabric's weave by running a thumb across it. She talked to the garments sometimes, not always out loud, but with a quality of attention that functioned like conversation, like listening. On the wall beside the register, he noticed a framed quote he had seen on his first visit, but hadn't properly read. "The mending is never really about the coat." E. Kershaw. He pointed at it one afternoon. "Your mother?" Josephine glanced over. "She said it to me when I was about 12. I'd ruined a seam on one of her pieces and I was upset with myself." A short breath. "I didn't understand what she meant until I was 30. What did she mean?" She considered him for a moment in a way that was becoming familiar, genuinely weighing the question. "What do you think she meant?" He thought about it honestly. "That the skill isn't the point." "Close." She turned back to her work. "The attention is the point." 5 days into what his calendar no longer reflected as a planned trip, Quinn's phone rang. His COO. The voice was controlled in the particular way that meant he was working hard to stay that way. "The Halpern Group is pulling out," he said. They want a meeting this week, or they walk. The Halpern acquisition had taken 14 months. Walking away from it now would cost the firm 6 weeks of runway, and the confidence of at least 2 board members who were already watching him with the attentiveness of people privately reconsidering something. "I'll be on the morning flight," Quinn said. He went back into the shop. Josephine knew before he said anything. There was something in how he was standing. "You have to go." "Tomorrow morning." She nodded. She finished the button she was sewing, tied off the thread, and didn't try to make it easier by pretending it was simpler than it was. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He looked at her. "I'll settle my account when I'm back in the area." She smiled the way she had when he'd first handed her the $80, not unkindly, not dismissively, as though his determination to pay her back in a form she would accept was something she found genuinely, quietly endearing. "You know where to find me," she said. He thanked her. He left. He was 2 blocks away when he reached into his jacket for his phone and found the receipt instead. He stopped on the sidewalk, unfolded it under a street lamp. Balance owing. One thing you're not ready to say out loud yet. He stood there for a long time. Then he folded it back into his pocket and kept walking. The Halpern meeting took 4 hours and saved the acquisition. Quinn's assistant told him afterward that he had been magnificent. He sat alone in the boardroom after everyone else had filed out, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the room still carrying the faint smell of other people's coffee. He reached into the jacket and took out the receipt. He had been thinking, on the flight and in the cab and in the spaces between the negotiations, about something his mother had said years ago about his father. That the man was never wrong exactly, only always speaking one conversation behind where he needed to be. She'd said it without bitterness, as an observation offered with the particular patience of someone who had made her own peace with a person's limits. The last message between Quinn and his father had been about the fence line on the property, a boundary dispute with a neighboring lot that had been simmering for 3 years. Quinn had sent a photograph of the survey document. His father had replied, "Looks right to me." That was October 3rd. His father had died October 9th. They had not spoken on the phone in 7 weeks. He sat in the empty boardroom and held the receipt and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only after a window is already closed, that he had spent the last months of his father's life optimizing the wrong things, spending attention on the fence line and the quarterly review and the restructured terms, and telling himself there was always next weekend for the phone call that actually mattered. He picked up his phone. He dialed the number of the cabin. His father's landline, which he had not yet canceled, rang twice 3 times. Of course it did. He had known it would. He said it anyway. He said, "I should have come sooner. I kept telling myself we had more time, and I used that belief to justify not being present, and that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong even while I was doing it. I'm sorry I let you feel like the survey document was more important than just calling to hear your voice." He stopped. He started again. He said, "I miss you. I didn't understand how much there was still left to say until there was no one to say it to." He sat in the empty room for a while after he hung up. Then he folded the receipt back into his pocket, buttoned his jacket, and went downstairs. He was on the road to Canmore by 7 the following morning. He didn't call ahead. He drove straight through, stopped for coffee and gas once, and pulled up in front of Kershaw Alterations at 11 on a Thursday morning. Through the window he could see Josephine at her workstation, her back to the street, her hands moving with their familiar unhurried precision over a length of dark fabric. He sat in the car for a moment. On the passenger seat was a bag from a cafe he'd spotted around the corner. 2 coffees, one black, one with oat milk, because he had noticed at some point during the last week that was how she took hers. He couldn't have said exactly when he'd noticed. He went in. She looked up. Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise and not quite the absence of it. Something closer to recognition, as though she had been quietly expecting him without quite knowing she was. "You came back," she said. "I still owe you a receipt." He set one of the coffees on the counter. His voice was not entirely steady, and he didn't try to make it otherwise. She looked at the cup, then at him. She opened the old wooden drawer and took out the rubber stamp. She placed his receipt on the counter, pressed the stamp down once cleanly, and lifted it. "Paid in full." She slid it across to him. He looked at the red letters. "My mother used to say, Josephine said quietly, "that some repairs take longer than others." She picked up her coffee. "That doesn't mean they don't hold." He looked up at her. "What does she mean on the wall? The mending is never about the coat." "I think you know now." He did. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd worked it out. Somewhere between Calgary and the last stretch of the Canada, probably, with no music on, and the mountains beginning to appear at the edge of the windshield, familiar and indifferent, and still there. He sat down in the customer chair, the one that had become, over the course of the last week, quietly his, and said the thing he had not been ready to say out loud yet. All of it. His father, the fence line, the 7 weeks without a phone call, the boardroom, the dead landline in an empty cabin in the Rockies. He said it the way he had learned, from watching Josephine work, that the best repairs are done, carefully, without rushing, without pretending the damage was anything other than what it was. Josephine listened. She did not redirect toward silver linings. She did not check the time or offer solutions. She listened the way the shop itself seemed to listen, with the settled, unhurried quality of a place that had been doing this for a very long time. When he was finished, neither of them spoke for a while. Finally he asked, "Did your mother ever turn anyone away?" "Never." A pause. "She said it takes more courage to come back than to arrive in the first place." He turned this over. The stamp. "She waited until they talked to give it?" "She waited until they were ready to move forward." Josephine looked at the corkboard. "She said you can tell. There's something different in the way a person holds themselves when they've put something down." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Does it work, putting things down?" She looked at him steadily. "You tell me." He considered it. His shoulders, he realized, were lower than they had been in 2 months, maybe longer. "Yeah," he said, "I think it does." That was 11 months ago. Quinn Larimer keeps his head office in Vancouver. He visits Canmore with a frequency that his calendar does not fully account for, and his assistant, who is perceptive in the way of people who have been watching a person closely for 6 years, has stopped asking why. When she schedules his Alberta project visits, and there are more of them now since he took on a regional development in the area, she quietly builds in an extra day without mentioning it. The corkboard at Kershaw Alterations has a few more receipts on it. The paid-in-full stamps are in red, same as always. The handwriting that fills in the balance owing line varies now. Sometimes it is Josephine's precise hand. Sometimes it's Quinn's on the afternoons when she is deep in a restoration and he is the one managing the front counter. He is clear with customers that he is not a tailor. He handles the scheduling, the receipts, the light carpentry when the old shelving needs reinforcement. He is useful in limited but genuine ways. One quiet afternoon in November, he found the original receipt in the inside pocket of his jacket while he was looking for a pen. He had forgotten he still carried it. The red stamp had bled slightly into the paper over time, blurring at the edges into something less definitive, and somehow more permanent. He set it on the counter. Josephine glanced over. "Still carrying it?" Seemed worth keeping. She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to her work. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to settle on the mountains, quietly, without announcement, the way the best things begin. He put the receipt back in his pocket. Some things you carry not because you still owe anything, because of what they remind you that you were finally, at last, ready to say.